And now the last part of what we want to talk about when we're dealing with construct validity is perhaps the thing we think about the most and perhaps the most important, which is it measuring what it's supposed to? So we've got our operational definitions. We've hopefully established that it's reliable. Now we can do the final check of thinking about, is our measure actually picking up on the behavior or the conceptual variable that we care about, that we want it to? And here we are going to look at a lot of subtypes of validity that we can look for. So you see them listed out here, and we'll go through these. There's face validity, content validity, criterion validity, convergent validity, and divergent validity. And so what we're going to do for the rest of this video is go through what these mean and also give you some examples of what it might look like. So let's start with face validity, which admittedly is probably the most subjective measure. That's also okay because if you remember from way back when, validity is not something we can measure quantitatively. It is sort of a subjective judgment, right? It's a decision. You say, we think it's strong, we think it's moderate, we think it's weak, we think it's very strong. With reliability, you can get actual numbers for things, but for validity, you can't. So it being a subjective measure is okay. But what we're really looking for is, does the measure look or appear like it would be a reasonable operational definition of the construct? And so basically, we're looking at, on its face, after a quick look at it, does it seem like the kind of questionnaire that would measure personality? Or if we're doing an observation, does an observation of that kind of behavior seems like it links to the conceptual variable you're interested in, like anger? And so the way to do this is, again, sort of check with experts, check with people in the field, share your measure with them and say, like, do you think on first glance this is going to measure what we think it's going to measure? And then also in peer review, you can get experts' opinions on these kinds of things as well. But I will say this, you can have valid tests that are counterintuitive and may lack face validity. Sometimes this is necessary, right? If you think of a situation where you not necessarily trying to deceive intentionally, but you're trying to obscure the purpose of the measure, you might want someone to think it's about something when you're really measuring something else. That measure might not be face valid. And I think that's okay. In my experience, that would probably be the least important validity. For those reasons, right? There are some situations where you wouldn't care about it so much. And in fact, you might intentionally make something not look face valid as a way of making it more construct valid. The next one we can talk about is content validity, which again is another subjective measure, and that's okay. Really what we're asking about is, does the measure capture all parts of the construct in question? So as I mentioned in the last video, something like neuroticism has many components. We've used this example of aggression. We can think of many different kinds of aggression: passive aggression, behavioral aggression, verbal aggression, microaggression. If I were to develop a measure that says this is a good measure of somebody's level of aggression, and I of course put a number to it, when we're asking the content validity question, what we're going to do is we're going to go through all of the scores, go through all of the questions, and sort of classify them maybe into like groups. So do we have enough questions about passive aggression? Do we have enough questions about violent aggression? Do we have enough questions about verbal aggression? And we want to make sure that each element of the overall conceptual variable is represented in the measure we're looking at. If it's not, if we're missing some, then we might call into question the content validity, where you might say, I think this isn't necessarily construct valid, or it's low, simply because it leaves out a whole chunk of this aspect of aggression, which I think is really important. One of the ways around this, of course, is to make your measure very specific. So it would be very difficult to make an entire measure of all kinds of aggression. And so what researchers are more likely to do is make a measure of just passive aggression or just verbal aggression or just violent aggression, and not try to measure all of those things at once, because that's difficult. So it is much easier to establish contact validity if the conceptual variable you're interested in is also more specific. The next sort of sub-criteria of validity is criterion-related validity, and this is actually an objective measure. This is something we can use numbers to support our conclusion here, unlike the previous two. And the question we're asking with this one is, does the measure correlate with the behavioral outcomes it should associate with? So saying this another way, or at least one example of saying this another way, do people's self-reports correlate with their actual behavior? Okay, so if I say on a survey item, I get my score and it says I'm risk-taking, I'm a risky person. Does that correlate with actual risky behaviors? Maybe I smoke, maybe I drink too much, maybe I like to go skydiving, maybe I'm a habitual speeder when I'm in the car, right? If our report is measuring what we think it should measure, it should correlate with people's actual behaviors, right? If it doesn't correlate with people's actual behaviors, then that tells us something important. And that important thing is you're just getting people's attitudes towards things that aren't going to predict what they actually do. Sometimes that's okay, but for most researchers, that would be a red flag, because it probably suggests that your questions are not picking up on the kinds of things in people's minds or brains that actually produce the behaviors they're actually doing. It is important to note for this slide and for future slides that one key difference with criterion-related validity is it has to do with correlating scores from a measure to a behavior and not to other measures. So scores that correlate one measure to another measure, that's a different kind of validity that we're going to talk about in a second. So to remember criterion-related validity, the thing you want to remember is it's the score on a self-report measure or an observational measure, and if it's related to actual behaviors or traces of behaviors that people actually engage in. As I just hinted at, one of the ways you can get this data is by observational self-report questions. So a lot of times on these questionnaires, in addition to asking about sort of the concept or abstract ideas of riskiness like sensation seeking, you might also ask specific questions like, how often do you smoke cigarettes? What's your average car speed? How much unprotected sex do you have? Things like that. So that's a really easy way to get at that information. There might be some problems with that, as we'll talk about in the next module. But the other way that is sometimes commonly used is called a known group analysis. And the question here is, can your measure differentiate between two different kinds of people or two different kinds of groups? So for instance, if I had a measure of, let's say, personality, where, there's this idea of type A personalities who are sort of intense and uptight and energetic, and there's these type B personalities who are laid back, sort of go with the flow, don't show a ton of initiative, and just kind of like, go with the flow. If your measure is accurately picking up on the difference between those two things, it should be able to predict probably, for example, people who are CEOs of, big competitive businesses and people who engage in, lower stress occupations, right? It should be able to pick up on different kinds, it should be able to predict who would be in this kind of job and who would be in that kind of job, right? If you were looking at a measure of depression, the score on that measure of depression should be able to predict who ends up in therapy and who doesn't end up in therapy, with the idea being that higher scores on depression would need therapy and therefore end up there, and people low on depression who are not struggling with that particular issue would not need to see therapists for that particular issue. So that would be a good example of where you could find that kind of information. So here's another example. Let's say I'm trying to measure the variable of connectedness to nature. That's my conceptual variable, and I come up with a self-report survey item measuring that, or at least purporting to measure that. In terms of criterion-related validity, what kinds of behaviors would I expect someone to do if they scored high on this measure? Right? What does somebody who is connected to nature, what kind of behaviors do they do? Well, we might expect that they do a lot of hiking, or they do a lot of camping, or maybe they go kayaking or canoeing. Maybe they do a lot of gardening, right? But we would not expect them necessarily to be people who stay inside and watch a lot of movies, or people who tend to go to concerts, right? Because, if you're connected to nature, your idea of a good time is, being outside, being with the natural world. If you feel not connected to nature, then your idea of a good time is probably the movies or television or a bar or something else. And it's not to say that people in one way or the other can't do the other, but it's also about the frequency of doing those behaviors. And the final thing I want to talk about here is convergent and divergent validity, which go hand in hand. They're sort of opposite sides of the same coin. And here is a situation where we're correlating a new measure, the measure we come up with, to other objective measures of similar constructs, or at least should be related constructs. So for something like convergent validity, we're asking the question, does the measure correlate with other measures or questionnaires that are theoretically relevant or related? And again, we can come up with an actual number here. Divergent validity sort of asks the opposite question, which is just as important, which is, does the measure not correlate with measures it shouldn't? Meaning, it should not be related to things we don't think theoretically it should have any association with. So going back to our previous example, I have this conceptual variable of feeling of emotional connectedness with the natural world. And I create a measure, a survey item, let's say it's 20 items, that I call the connectedness to nature scale. And I want to show to other researchers who might be interested in using this that in fact my measure does measure what we think it's supposed to, that it does actually measure my conceptual variable. Now, of course, by this point, we would have shown it's reliable. We also would have demonstrated or tried to demonstrate content validity, face validity, and now we're looking at these other elements of criterion-related validity, convergent validity, and divergent validity. So I can look at things like ecologically related behaviors, hiking, camping, things like that. And another measure, this is called new ecological paradigm, which is another published measure that a researcher made that measures people's feelings about, environmental preservation. And what I should see for those two specifically is positive high correlations. That is, people who score high on the connectedness to nature measure should also score high on my new ecological paradigm score. Because if you're connected to nature, you should feel strongly about preserving the environment. And so we would call that convergent validity. Similarly, we would expect, as we mentioned, people who score high on the connectedness to nature scale to also endorse frequently a lot of those behaviors, camping, hiking, kayaking, whatever it might be. And so that would be our evidence of criterion-related validity. In contrast, we should not, or we would hope not to see relationships between social desirability and connectedness to nature, and we'd hope not to see a relationship between scholastic aptitude and connectedness to nature. If we get positive correlations there, it suggests that something's wrong. So let's take social desirability. Social desirability is almost a personality trait in which somebody is the kind of person who always wants to be seen or viewed by others as doing the cool or right thing. And it really doesn't matter what it is. They're always interested in just being on the right side. So, somebody who takes this um, connectedness to nature scale might not really feel connected to nature, but might think like, oh, all the people in my neighborhood are really eco-conscious, and I like my neighborhood, so I also want to be viewed that way. And so I'm going to go out of my way to just make it seem like I'm over the top connected. Well, we can pick up on that kind of thing by measuring an entirely different thing that measures your ability to do that. And so that's what researchers do. And so if connectedness to nature is correlated with social desirability, it suggests something important. What it suggests is that my measure is not measuring connectedness to nature fully, but part of it is measuring social desirability, and that would not be good. That would be a strike against our construct validity, because I now can't say I'm actually truly only measuring connectedness to nature. I'm measuring something else. Similar with scholastic aptitude, right? If an IQ test correlates with your survey of connectedness to nature, well, that's not great, because what it suggests is that something about your survey is picking up on people's intellect level. And there should be no reason why connectedness to nature should have anything to do with your intellect level. People of all levels of intellect should be able to feel connected to nature. So ideally, we don't want those things to be correlated with one another. And if they are, it suggests that maybe there's some element in there that's picking up on that. So maybe we worded our questions um, not plainly enough, and we were using sort of unnecessarily difficult vocabulary, for example. There could be other reasons too. But the important point here is to point out that for things that theoretically shouldn't be related to someone's ability to connect to nature, we should not see correlations like that. And that's the idea of divergent validity. So these three things work together: convergent validity, criterion-related validity, and divergent validity. And together with those numerical measures, we should be able to get a good sense of whether our measure is measuring what we think it's supposed to.